For almost a decade, it was the conflict that defined an era, the Iraq War. It wasn't some distant battle you just saw on the news. It completely reshaped global politics, and honestly, we're still feeling the aftershocks today. So how did it all start? What actually happened on the ground? And what did it all mean in the end? Well, let's break it all down. All right, we're going to trace this story in four main parts. First up, the case for war. What were the arguments that got us there? Then, we'll look at that lightning-fast invasion and the seemingly quick victory. After that, we dive into how things spiraled into a chaotic insurgency. And finally, we'll tally up the staggering costs and consequences. So what really lit the fuse for this war? To get that, you have to transport yourself back to the days right after the September 11th attacks. In that climate of, fear and total uncertainty, the Bush administration really zeroed in on Iraq and Saddam Hussein. They started building a case that something had to be done, and done soon. And this Axis of Evil speech, this was a huge moment. It was really the first time Iraq was framed not just as some regional headache, but as a direct, major threat to the entire world. When President Bush accused Saddam of chasing the world's most destructive weapons, it was the public groundwork being laid for everything that was about to happen. The whole case really boiled down to two pretty terrifying claims. First, that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and was hiding them. And second, that Saddam Hussein was actively working with al-Qaeda. Now, you gotta remember, the world was still reeling from 9/11. The idea of those two threats coming together, that was the core argument presented to the American people and the world. To really sell this to a skeptical world, Secretary of State Colin Powell gave this now famous presentation at the United Nations. He's holding up vials, showing satellite photos, laying out all this intelligence, all to argue that this was the proof, that Iraq was hiding WMDs. I mean, this wasn't just another speech. It was the big, high-stakes pitch to get the world on board for war. But yeah, not everyone was buying it. This quote from Germany's foreign secretary, it just perfectly captures the mood from some of America's closest allies. Countries like France and Germany, they pushed back hard. They wanted more inspections, more diplomacy. They just didn't think the evidence was there. And that pushback was a really big deal. It meant that when the war did start, it wouldn't have the full backing of the UN Security Council. And so even with all those divisions, the invasion was launched. And that initial phase, wow, it was all about incredible speed and just overwhelming military force. On March 20th, 2003, this thing kicked off with a bang, literally. It was a massive bombing campaign called Shock and Awe. At the same time, ground troops from what was called the Coalition of the Willing, mostly the US, the UK, Australia, and Poland, started rolling in from Kuwait. And the advance was just stunningly fast. We're talking less than 3 weeks to get to the capital. Then on April 9th, Baghdad fell. The image everyone remembers from that day is of Saddam Hussein's giant statue being pulled down in Firdos Square. It was this powerful symbol that his 24-year iron grip on the country was finally over. This moment right here really captures that triumphant feeling of the first few weeks. Just 6 weeks in, President Bush lands on an aircraft carrier, and under this giant mission accomplished banner, he declares that major combat operations are over. It was this iconic image of victory, but as we all know now, it became deeply ironic because the war was about to enter a much, much bloodier phase. And that brings us to the war's really difficult second act, because taking down the government didn't bring peace. Not at all. It was more like it tore the lid off a pressure cooker, creating this huge power vacuum that unleashed years of a vicious insurgency and a brutal civil war. Okay, so you have to understand this one key decision called debassification. The idea sounded simple: get rid of everyone from Saddam's ruling party to cleanse the government. But the way they did it was a disaster. They fired tens of thousands of people, from generals all the way down to school teachers, and they completely disbanded the Iraqi army. So what happened? You suddenly had a huge number of unemployed, armed, and very angry men. They became the perfect recruiting pool for an insurgency. So what did this mess actually look like on the ground? Well, Iraq basically devolved into a chaotic free-for-all. You had Sunni insurgents who felt they'd lost everything. You had foreign fighters like the incredibly brutal al-Qaeda in Iraq pouring in to start a sectarian war. Then you had powerful Shia militias rising up, fighting pretty much everyone. It was this horrifying, multi-sided conflict where it was hard to even know who was fighting whom on any given day. And in the middle of all this chaos,
a few events really poured gasoline on the fire. In 2006, the bombing of a sacred Shia mosque. That just unleashed this terrible wave of revenge killings, pushing the country into an all-out civil war. To try and stop the bleeding, the U.S. launched the troop surge in 2007, sending in over 20,000 more soldiers. And right in the middle of it all, Saddam Hussein himself was captured, put on trial, and executed by an Iraqi court.
Which brings us to our final section, the aftermath. The bill for all this, when you measure it in lives, in dollars, in just global stability, is almost hard to comprehend. It's staggering. Let's just start with the money. One study from 2013 put the direct cost to the U.S. at $1.7 trillion. And it's a number so big, it's hard to even wrap your head around it. But here's the kicker. That was just the initial price tag. When you factor in long-term costs like interest and veteran health care, the true total could end up being more like $6 trillion. Of course, money is one thing. The human cost is something else entirely. By the time the mission officially ended in 2011, 4,826 coalition service members had lost their lives. The vast majority of them were Americans. These are real people with families who didn't come home. And for the Iraqi people themselves, the toll is just heartbreaking. The Iraq Body Count Project, which only tracks documented deaths from violence, puts the number of civilians killed at over 110,000. It's a devastating figure. And it's so important to remember that other studies, which include deaths from disease and displacement, suggest the real number could be several times higher. And the ripples just kept spreading across the whole region. Remember that Al-Qaeda in Iraq group we talked about? Well, they didn't just disappear. They survived, they mutated, and they used the chaos from the civil war next door in Syria to rebrand themselves as something even more terrifying, the Islamic State, or ISIL. And their rise would drag the U.S. and its allies right back into another brutal conflict in Iraq just a few years later. So the formal end of this first chapter came on December 18, 2011. After nearly 9 years of war, the last convoy of American combat troops finally rolled across the border into Kuwait. Operation Iraqi Freedom was officially over. And that leaves us here. The Iraq War didn't just end in 2011. It fundamentally redrew the map of the Middle East, it changed America's role in the world, and it left behind a legacy of instability that we are absolutely still dealing with today. Understanding this conflict isn't just a history lesson. It's about understanding the world we live in right now. So the real question for all of us is, what are the most important lessons we should take away from it all?